In 44 Liquormart, Inc. versus Rhode Island, the United States Supreme Court evaluated the constitutionality of commercial speech restrictions under the First Amendment. Rhode Island enacted two statutes banning the advertising of alcoholic beverage prices. One applied to those in the alcohol business, the other applied to Rhode Island's news media. The state's theory was that banning price advertising would result in higher alcohol prices, which would reduce consumption. The state's liquor control administrator ruled that the retailer, 44 Liquormart, violated that law when it ran a newspaper ad implying it charged low liquor prices. 44 Liquormart sued the administrator, and the state intervened as a principal defendant. The district court concluded that the price advertising bans unconstitutionally restricted commercial speech. The bans didn't directly advance Rhode Island's temperance interest and were more extensive than necessary to serve that interest anyway. Plus, the 21st Amendment, which delegated to the states the power to prohibit alcohol use, didn't change Rhode Island's heavy First Amendment burden. The Court of Appeals reversed. It agreed with Rhode Island's arguments that advertised prices caused price competition, lowered prices, and increased alcohol consumption. The appellate court also concluded that the 21st Amendment gave the state's bans an added presumption of validity. The United States Supreme Court granted cert to consider the constitutionality of a total ban on truthful, non-misleading commercial speech. The court unanimously agreed that Rhode Island's bans were unconstitutional and that the 21st Amendment didn't save these otherwise unconstitutional restrictions on commercial speech. But the justices differed over precisely why the bans were unconstitutional. 7 justices agreed that some version of the Supreme Court's test from Central Hudson Gas and Electric Corporation versus Public Service Commission should govern. The Central Hudson test has 4 parts. First, for the First Amendment to protect commercial speech, the speech must concern lawful activity and not be misleading. Second, the asserted governmental interest must be substantial. Third, the regulation must directly advance that interest. Fourth, the regulation can't be more extensive than necessary to serve the governmental interest. The justices applying Central Hudson agreed that Rhode Island's bans satisfied the first 2 parts of the test. First, consuming alcohol was lawful, and the bans prohibited truthful, non-misleading price advertising. Second, Rhode Island's asserted interest in its citizens' temperance was substantial. But those justices concluded that the price advertising bans failed Central Hudson's final 2 legs. Justice Stevens, joined by Justices Kennedy, Souter, and Ginsburg, concluded that because the bans completely prohibited truthful, non-misleading commercial speech, the bans should be reviewed with, quote, special care, unquote. The bans didn't directly advance Rhode Island's temperance goal. Under the court's heightened scrutiny, Rhode Island had to show that the bans advanced its interest to a material degree. Marginal or ineffective prohibitions would be inadequate. Although the bans might impact purchasing patterns, no evidence established that they significantly reduced alcohol consumption. Even under the less strict standard applicable to most commercial speech regulations, these bans were more extensive than necessary to serve the state's interest. Rhode Island had other, more effective means which were less intrusive on First Amendment interests to achieve its goal. For example, it could have imposed direct price controls or increased alcohol taxes. Thus, Rhode Island couldn't show a reasonable fit between its speech prohibition and its interest. In a separate concurrence, Justice O'Connor, joined by Chief Justice Rehnquist and Justices Souter and Breyer, also applied Central Hudson. However, the concurring justices didn't think heightened review applied. Rather, under the existing standard, Rhode Island's prohibitions were more extensive than necessary to accomplish its goal. Although the First Amendment didn't require Rhode Island to employ the least restrictive means to achieve its temperance goal, the fit between its goal and its method had to be narrowly tailored. But here, the fit wasn't reasonable. Like Justice Stevens, Justice O'Connor noted that Rhode Island had other ways to more directly advance its goal without impeding a seller's right to provide truthful, non-misleading information to customers. Justices Scalia and Thomas, in 2 separate concurrences, expressed their dissatisfaction with the Central Hudson test. Scalia would have consulted historical advertising regulation practices. Meanwhile, Thomas concluded that the state's interest in preventing the flow of accurate information to manipulate customer choice was per se illegitimate and couldn't justify the prohibition of commercial or non-commercial speech. Though the court was divided on the proper standard, 44 Liquormart makes clear that complete bans on truthful, non-misleading advertising rarely pass constitutional muster.